Or... Right, yes, please.
Okay. Hi. So you and some of your colleagues use your Christian faith to justify your stance on certain issues and topics. But when you look at the Gospels and what Jesus taught, there was such an emphasis on looking after the most poor and the most vulnerable and marginalised in society. Yet when you look at your own voting record, some of the arguments you make and rhetoric, and that of some of your colleagues, it seems like you ignore this fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. So I was just wondering what that's about.
And then, thank you. Obviously, Mr. Rees Mogg, you are on the Conservative wing of the Conservative Party. Do you think there is a place for classical liberalism in the Conservative Party?
I might ask them in reverse order, because that is a very easy question to answer, because I'm probably more of a classical liberal than you think, certainly in terms of economic policy, and I am not on the authoritarian wing of the Conservative Party in terms of law and order, and I believe in our ancient liberties, which I think are of great importance: the protection of trial by jury, the presumption of innocence rather than of guilt, the protection from unreasonable searches by agents of the state, the requirement, I've been very sympathetic to the pro-Europeans on the issue of Henry VIII clauses, because I don't think the executive should have power to tell us all what to do without any say-so of Parliament. So I'm more of a classical liberal than I might want to admit to myself, but certainly than some of you may think. To come to the question of Christianity and the teaching of the Gospels, and your basic question, am I a Pharisee? Which I think is a very interesting point. I believe that conservative solutions help the poorest in society most. Okay, let me tell you what I want from Brexit. I want us to take tariffs off food, clothing and footwear. Food, clothing and footwear make up 21% of the average family's budget. But for the poorest in society, that is a higher percentage, inevitably. The average tariff on clothing and footwear is about 11.5% plus 20% VAT. So you're talking about 13.5% to 14% tariffs on clothing and footwear. On food, the tariffs are so high that there's very little import from outside the European Union. If you can make the 21% of people's expenditure, and it's more, as I say, for the poorest in society, 20% lower once you've taken off the tariffs and you've taken away the non-tariff barriers, that is a dramatic improvement in the standard of living in the poorest in society, and frankly it makes remarkably little difference to the richest in society, who have a much lower expenditure on those essentials. That's why I say conservatism helps the poorest in society. Go back to Margaret Thatcher and the sale of council... Thank you. The sale of council houses was transformative in allowing people to become part of a property-owning democracy, to give them a real stake in society. And it allowed people freedom over their own lives. They weren't any longer told by the council what colour they had to paint their front door. And it gave people a stake in their society, it gave their children a stake in society, and it helped get people out of poverty. These things are really transformative, and they are conservative. And I have never thought that you make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. It doesn't work. It's been tried and it fails. Capitalism actually lifts everybody. And if you don't believe me, okay, if you don't believe me, look at the transformation globally as China and India have become capitalist. If you go back to 1980, over 50% of the world was living on under $1 a day. This is now under 20%, and it's almost entirely down to China and India have abandoned socialism. And that has lifted the poorest in the world standard of living. And those of us who are capitalists should be really proud of that, because that is a capitalist success.
I promised I'd read some out, so I'll read 2 more quick ones for you, and then we'll take some more from the audience. Someone said, since you said you would be honest in your answers, do you honestly believe Theresa May will be Prime Minister by the 31st of March 2019? and this one, I think I know how you will answer this one. Did you enjoy Frankie Boyle's description of you as, quote, a composite drawn from the nightmares of 18th century mill workers?
Yes, and I think most of the mill workers were 19th century rather than 18th century, so I would have enjoyed it more if he'd been a little bit more historically accurate.
Right.
Okay, so over the last 8 years now, we've seen a massive rise in poverty. A fifth of the UK population now live in poverty, and child poverty has gone up dramatically. Do you agree that this is an absolute disgrace? Do you agree that this has been caused by Conservative Party policies, and what would you do to change the situation?
And we'll get through more if we don't applaud the question. And now the woman, yes, please.
Hi, Mr. Mogg, Rees Mogg. It's Brenda from Bristol. I'd like to ask you what incentives the government are implementing to support SMEs in preparation for Brexit. I note that Enterprise Ireland, they have a scheme offering a €5,000 grant, and I'd like to know whether our government are likely to implement the same scheme.
Okay. On the issue of poverty, it very much depends on what figures you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with relative poverty or absolute poverty. Absolute poverty has continued to decline in this country, and interestingly, inequality is at its lowest level since 1985 in this country. And what the government has done with its welfare reforms, to my mind, has been really important. And as it's rolled out, as the universal credit is rolled out, key, because it will ensure that there is always an incentive to be employed rather than unemployed. It takes away the poverty trap. So, under the universal credit, 63% of benefits will be withdrawn for every pound earned. And that sounds high, and in my view it's too high, and it should be an object of policy to reduce it. But currently it's over 90% that is withdrawn, which means that people who go into work find that they can be worse off than if they remain on benefits. And the best way out of poverty is work, and that's always been the case. So the universal credit is the greatest answer to dealing with the poverty issue, but it's a relative poverty issue in this country, not an absolute poverty issue. In terms of what is the government doing to help SMEs, as far as I'm aware, there are no specific grants in relation to Brexit. What the government ought to be doing, and it's easier for me as a backbencher to say what the government ought to be doing, it should be ensuring that we get the benefits of Brexit, and that is taking some of the regulations off the shoulders of SMEs. It was rumoured before the last budget that the Chancellor wanted to lower the VAT threshold, so that more companies would have had the bureaucracy of dealing with VAT. It's completely the wrong way around. What we want to be doing is raising the VAT thresholds to take the administrative burden off companies. There's this whole proposal for digitisation of tax, so that companies, small companies, have to make quarterly returns. This is absolutely bananas. It will put people off going into business, and it will make small businesses have higher costs because they will simply have to pay their accountants more to make the returns. So what I would like to see us do is stop thinking of silly regulations that will make life of SMEs worse, and then once we've left the European Union, and that relates to the VAT threshold, which we can't put up until we've left the European Union, look at ways of easing regulations on SMEs so they can get on with the business of doing business, which is what they want.
So let me start first by pouring you a drink, and secondly, without giving away any secrets, and about other people we've invited to this series to speak. You're the only one we've had to employ an overflow lecture theatre for. And you're the only one where the event sold out within a couple of hours. What is it about someone who's been an MP for 7 years and never held ministerial office, or even been on his own party's front bench, that draws a crowd like that?
Well, I put it entirely down to your organisation and the fact that people want to come and hear you. And that as the series has grown, more people want to come along. it's very hard to see oneself as others see one. However hard one tries, and it's one of the great aims that one should have in life, to try and understand what do other people see positively and negatively about one's own attributes, which is quite difficult to analyse. And so the honest answer is I don't really know why people want to come. I can only guess. And my guess would be the hope that I might say something slightly controversial, but perhaps most importantly, that I'll say what I think. And therefore, if you ask me a question, with a bit of luck, I'll answer it without particularly thinking whether spin doctors would think that was a good answer or not. And I have a feeling that there is a desire in politics for less controlled answers, more straightforward answers, that people can then engage with and argue back about. I mean, I'm very flattered that there are protesters outside. That's great, because they want to engage in political debate. And that's really important, because I think my arguments are good arguments, and if I can engage in debate, I might be able to persuade people that conservatism is worth supporting.